Joining me now from Washington, Kristen Soltis, a Republican pollster with the Winston Group. She was with us yesterday, and in Philadelphia, Camille Charles, the chair of the Africana Studies Department at the University of Pennsylvania and a former Obama advisor. Both of you, thanks for being here. What an extraordinary night. Anytime we witness democracy like that, on that scale, being exercised, it's inspirational in some ways. But let me start with you first, Camille. Obama wins, he wins big, but he loses 10 million voters. What's your takeaway from last night's win?
I think it's important to understand that certainly people were disappointed. I think they expected to see more of a recovery than there was. And in some cases, I think people still like Obama, but they don't think that he's going to be able to get it done with a Republican House and people who weren't really as interested in cooperating. But I think we also saw some increases in anti-black attitudes over the course of his first term that might have influenced voting among some segments of the white population who were uncomfortable the first time around. As we know, whites in both parties in 2008 still expressed quite a bit of anti-black sentiment and often couldn't quite put their finger on whatever their issue with the president. And this time around, with the economy still being not too far out of the toilet, so to speak, they had something they could put their finger on this time around, I think, and it changes things some.
Those are strong words, Kristen. And I remember when Obama was first elected 4 years ago, he was supposed to usher in this post-racial age, right? And in fact, the very opposite's happened. The day after the election, we're talking about why white voters, male white voters, especially outside of Ohio, where I think the auto bailout had an impact, essentially turned very far away from Barack Obama and turned to Mitt Romney. Is race a factor in this election?
I don't think race is nearly as much a factor as Camille thinks, but when you look at the exit polls, it is really striking. There was such a big difference this year. You did have 90+% of African American voters sticking with the president. The one group that sort of Mitt Romney underperformed with versus where McCain performed 4 years ago was Latino voters as well. I think that's a really big storyline coming out of this election, is that the Republican Party over the last 4 years has not made inroads with the Latino community. George W. Bush actually won 44% of all Hispanic voters in 2004 when he ran for re-election. Mitt Romney lost Latino voters by a 44-point margin yesterday. That's an enormous change, and it's really something that the Republican Party is going to need to look at and address in incoming elections.
Camille, expand on your comment, if you will, not only on the African-American rule that you talk about there, but also perhaps how that cuts also in the Latino way and the white male voter.
So, I want to be clear, too, that I don't think that white Republicans or even white independents are the only whites that Obama lost. As I said, I think there were a substantial number of Democrats in 2008, white Democrats, who adhered to anti-black stereotypes and could express those feelings. And that it isn't necessarily a conscious decision that, I've decided to turn my back on the black guy. I think it's a much less conscious and a much more sort of part of our sort of DNA, so to speak.
Just so I don't mean to interrupt you, but in Canada, we don't talk about race in the same way here. So I appreciate what you're saying. You're suggesting that race and anti-black feelings really drove a large part of the American population against Obama last night. That's what you're saying?
No, I'm not. Again, I am not saying that it was the sort of overwhelming factor. What I would say is that he might not catch the same kind of breaks in terms of the way that we're willing to understand his underperformance with respect to, say, getting a jobs bill done, or in terms of support for the Affordable Care Act, given that a lot of what was in that legislation was supported by Republicans, and in fact that rank-and-file Americans across party lines do in fact like the elements of the Affordable Care Act. It's just that often, depending on how you formulate the questions about it, you can get a lot of opposition to it. I think the issue with Latino voters is that, George W. Bush had a different attitude toward immigration than Mitt Romney did. And I think that, in fact, when you saw the emergence of the Tea Party and some of the backlash after the 2008 election, a lot of that does get focused on Latinos. The immigration issue becomes a huge issue again, also as we see the numbers in terms of the share of the population in the United States that is Latino. So what you see really is kind of this perfect storm. You have the election of the nation's first non-white male president. You have the biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression. And you have a demographic circumstance where in not too long, the majority of the American population will be non-white. And that you put all of that together. And it's in those circumstances that you do start to see white resentment, white fear, this idea that the America that I have known isn't anymore.
All right.
And how do we respond to that? I think this idea that we're post-racial because we elected one black guy is ridiculous. And it's this nice idea, but I think we still haven't really dealt with deeper racial issues in this country that we're still afraid to talk to, and so it's too soon to say that we are ushering in a post-racial era.
The challenge for the Republicans on this, Kristen, because demographics are changing, the power of the Latino vote, the power of the African-American vote, we haven't even talked about the power of the young vote, of course, which crosses all sorts of lines there as well. Looking at last night, the role the Tea Party played and how this played out for the Republicans, do the Republicans have to look now and say, what are our constituents? Who are we appealing to? Did the Tea Party help us or hurt us? What questions do Republicans have to ask themselves?
So I think Republicans do have to ask themselves, how do we modernize our principles to be applicable in the 21st century? So Republicans love to talk about how great a president Ronald Reagan was and how they want to see those Reagan principles applied. But we don't often do a very good job of explaining how we can reapply those Reagan principles today to, say, help that 24-year-old start his or her own business. So you have a lot of folks that are saying maybe tax cuts aren't the great Band-Aid to every problem. And I think that's the real question that Republicans have to ask themselves. Not, do we need to change our principles, but how are we going to apply them to solve problems? Why aren't
Republicans appealing to Latinos? Why aren't African Americans and Latinos? Why aren't these groups finding a home in the Republican Party?
Well, so African Americans for a long time have been a very strongly Democratic constituency. Republicans have tried to make efforts there. We've had prominent African American leaders in our party in Congress, J.C. Watts being one great example. We've with Latino voters, again, as recently as 8 years ago, we're doing reasonably well. I do think that the conversation around immigration in the Republican primary was unhelpful. And I think that's a big thing that we're going to have to address moving forward is how do we talk about the need to reform immigration in a way that provides some kind of sensible solution. I know that Senator Marco Rubio was working on an alternative to the DREAM Act. It kind of got pushed aside when President Obama implemented his own sort of executive orders on the issue. But I think there will be a change in that conversation.
Well, we'll find out if Rubio runs in the next election. I got about a minute left. Camille and Kristen, just real quick if I could. Canadians looking at this, the issues on marijuana and gay marriage. Let me start with you real quick, Camille. Is America bending left? Is that a signal?
I think America has always been complicated. And I think we're in a moment where we've got a big young population. And, they're kind of looking at marijuana. We now have medical marijuana in certain instances. And I think that sort of starts to open the door to saying, well, maybe if we legalized it, it wouldn't be so bad. And I think also with the way that it's been criminalized, possibly unnecessarily, I think there are those who really see it as a way to normalize its usage, regulate it in some ways, and again, sort of tackle the drug trade from a different point of view. But I mean, I do think we're young, we're younger, we're more complicated than we've ever been in terms of, sort of falling conservative on some things and liberal on others. I think we're open.
All right, Kristen, real quick, what's your take on this?
I don't think it's a move leftward so much as a move more libertarian. These are positions that are more in line with where younger voters are. It's a sign of their impact on the electorate.
All right, Kristen Soltis, Camille Charles. I mean, we always thought Canada was supposed to be this other sort of hippieville, but you're now part of some hippie nation down there. Very interesting election last night. I appreciate your perspectives on it. On a more serious note, there's lots going on to analyze what drove those election results. I appreciate your insight today. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
All right, that's
Thanks
great.
for having me.
Kristen Soltis and Camille Charles. Excellent stuff from both of them.